We're just so excited today. We have a great webinar coming up, and we're going to talk about why great agent experiences are the key to unlocking stellar CX. This is a really big topic, so let's kick it off. Oops. Just to get things started, we'll introduce ourselves so that you know who is talking to you about this topic. So my name is Leah. I am our head of demand generation here at Maestro QA. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you to do an introduction.
Thanks, Leah. Hey, y'all. My name is Michelle. I'm our team manager of customer success here at Maestro. I also work with some of our amazing customers, so get to kind of wear a bunch of hats here. But super excited to be here today and to dig in.
Awesome. So we're going to kick things off as the introduction just by grounding ourselves in a couple of reasons why the agent experience is so important. This section will be relatively quick compared to the rest of the webinar. And then from there, Michelle's really going to take over and dive into a lot of actionable strategies and ways that you can improve the agent experience at your companies. So without further ado, I think thing number one of why the agent experience is so critical is that it directly impacts your customer experience. And the data shows this. In a Glassdoor study, even a 1-star increase in employee satisfaction led to a 2.6% increase in CSAT. So there is a meaningful correlation there. I mean, we always like to think of the Trader Joe's experience, and I'm a Trader Joe's loyalist. I go to the one in Union Square literally every week, but you can just tell that the employees there, they're really happy to be there. They're happy to work there, and they're really happy to help. And it's not just that Trader Joe's has great groceries, it's that they are aligned with the brand values. There's a really clear sort of path to career progression laid out for them, and they're encouraged to be themselves. And again, consistently rated one of the best places to work. So all in all, it directly impacts your customer experience. Second reason, happy agents are a lot easier to retain. Retaining your talent is really critical, not only for your company's bottom line. Of course, the cost of onboarding an agent is high. We have some tools, mainly our ROI calculator, can help you figure out what those costs are. But it's not only sort of the monetary cost, but it's also, hold on. My sharing just paused really quickly while my computer decided to do an update, but I have turned that off. All right, there we go. Back to the slides. So cost of onboarding is high, not only from a monetary perspective, but also from a cultural perspective, right? You don't want people to be constantly leaving. And as folks leave, there's a lot of knowledge that also walks out the door about your company. We're going to hit on this point time and time again in the webinar, but your agents probably know every detail about your business best. And next up, the voice of the customer really starts with the voice of the agent. So, your agents are engaging with your customers all the time. They know exactly how people feel. And when you're engaged and happy at work, you are more likely to proactively share those insights and to take initiative. If you are disengaged, overworked, and unhappy, you're probably less inclined to do that and have more of the clock in, clock out mentality. This also sort of looking at the way that most companies operate, there are often a lot of information silos between CX and other departments within themselves. So your agents are in a really unique position to sort of have their hands in a little bit of everything. And again, you want them to be bringing that knowledge forth. So again, I said that part was going to be quick. Now we're going to dive into the real ways that you can elevate the agent experience. We're going to focus on 4 key concepts today, being alignment, recognition, engagement, and progression. And so kicking off into the first one, alignment. Basically, all this means is aligning your team around a really clearly defined brand voice and mission. One way that you can communicate these concepts to your team are through your onboarding process, of course, but then also through QA and through how you build your scorecards and how you're sort of grading agent interactions. And so I'll pass it over to Michelle. She's going to dive deep into chatting a bit about Etsy's agent certification program.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. I just want to double down that I think alignment is so important when we think about the agent experience. Like, we want to make sure, I really like this point around making sure that agents are aligned with your company's mission and values. Like, that really comes through. We'll start to talk about like scorecards and coaching, but like making sure agents know like what the business cares about and making sure that they're working to embody those things with your customers. Like, there's so much empowerment that comes from that. And we also want agents aligned with their managers about expectations, with our graders about their QA program and QA scores. Like, creating that sense of alignment just helps agents feel more engaged with their work. And I loved this example from Etsy, so I'll kind of dig into their certification program. They had done like a case study or webinar with us a little while back about this program. And I'll kind of quote from them a little bit here, but basically they were starting to see that direct supervisor coaching was the top driving factor for improving agent performance, which makes sense, right? Like, coaching can be tailored to each agent's needs in a way that training is more high level. And so this was kind of how their certification program was born. And so this certification is for any new agents that are onboarding at Etsy. And it really involves taking all of their different tools in their tech stack and building them out in a way that supports agent learning before they start taking tickets. So things like going through Lessonly and taking lessons, integrating Lessonly with Zendesk and Maestro to bring that story together. Giving agents a chance to practice taking tickets. So taking tickets in a low risk environment and more controlled, intuitive space. So that way they can learn and try and fail and feel safe doing so. And then once they have that knowledge and understanding built up, that's when, and that process typically, I think, took like 4 to 6 weeks. And that's when agents who pass would then enter the Zendesk queue with a suite of tickets that kind of match their certification level. What this built, and like why I like it as an alignment example, is it just made sure that agents were totally aligned on what was expected of them. We weren't kind of sending them off into the wilderness to figure out these tickets, kind of dig through our LMS for answers. They had this controlled space to really learn, and so that way, going into their role for the first time, they knew exactly what was expected of them. And there were like metrics impacts, as we see here, from going through that program. Certified agents were scoring 14% higher on QA and reaching that average of 100%, which is wild and awesome, and really shows the value of taking that time to build alignment for new teammates. So yeah, I thought that was a really cool example of ways that we've seen this done, and I've heard a lot of other companies do this in different ways too.
Awesome. So alignment, I think we're pretty good there. The next one that's really, really critical is this concept of engagement. And so I'm going to give, a quick overview of Melissa Matros. She's the SVP of product management at Salesforce Service Cloud. And they've been doing a lot of thought leadership on this recently. She believes, and the company believes, that an engaged employee is somebody who is motivated to deliver great service and really to support the company mission. Engaged team members don't view their job as a paycheck, right? They see themselves as part of something that has a measurable impact on a certain community or a certain industry, and that through performing their job, they're positively impacting that, but they're also contributing to their own personal growth and really, really aligning with their career goals, which we'll tap into a little bit more later on. But I think this overall philosophy of engagement, like, it all makes sense, but I think the big shift in the industry is that there's now the technology and a tech ecosystem that can really, really support agents in this mission. And so it's that move from workforce management to workforce engagement. Again, less about the clock in, clock out paycheck mentality, and more about how do we support and empower people to do their jobs really, really well. So on the technical side, this looks at a very high level like having really, really great scheduling and support demand forecasting so that you can ensure that folks, have sufficient time off. They have the ability to recharge, but then of course that management knows, the right staffing levels that they need to have on hand. As Michelle, you alluded to a bit earlier, having a learning management system have sort of a house for all of your product and company knowledge that agents need to know. It enables them to learn and course correct faster, and also ultimately to help your customers. And then integrated quality management being the third piece of that, empowers, a really personalized sort of that one-to-one human coaching conversation that has a human touch to it, right? It isn't punitive. It isn't like, oh, you just got this wrong and it's wrong. It's how can I help you grow and develop and see trends maybe between different points of learning? Michelle, I know you have a lot of thoughts around this topic.
I'm sitting here nodding along. I'm like, okay, I've got lots of things to say. Totally. I think you hit the nail on the head for a lot here, Leah. I think you can really feel the difference between this concept of workforce management versus that engagement. Like, I think the goals are really different. When we talk about engagement and we think back to the slide a few earlier where we're talking about the hearing the voice of our agents because they know the voices of our customers, like engagement really values the voices of our agents, as we should, because they know so much about our business. And so kind of taking this lens of creating an engaging place to work, creating an engaging team, and having the tools to support that, I think are really important. Here at Maestro, like we talk about QA a lot and coaching because that's a lot of what our tool does. But I think when I'm often working with customers, like that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not just QA and coaching and they're checking the boxes. It's really important to integrate your tech stack in a way that supports agent engagement and success. If there's a question on the rubric, the answer should be in our LMS somewhere. The answer should be in our knowledge base. Like agents should have that kind of full cohesion around how to be super successful. And yeah, the example I thought, Leah, I'd pull from here is we had talked with Brooklinen about this CX university that they had built out that I think really speaks to this engagement concept super well. Essentially kind of similar to what we see with Etsy, but in looking at not just onboarding, but full engagement of the agent throughout their journey and throughout their time with their company. Brooklinen found that, and I'm sure we all have felt this too, but as we move towards a remote workforce, it's a lot harder to drive engagement. We don't have these in-person interactions or trainings and things like that. And so the onus is really on us to figure out how to build that out in a remote world in a way that's engaging. And the way Brooklinen did this is kind of translating that to a university and thinking about having lectures, textbooks, and tests as a way to promote learning, like promoting different learning styles as a way to drive engagement. So our lectures being like our learning management, our LMS, like having lessons to go through. Our textbooks being our knowledge base. So where are agents finding their answers? Where can they read up and learn more? And then our tests being like our QA program. So creating that feedback loop of sharing, of like understanding how agents are performing, sharing that feedback, and then coaching on that feedback in a way to ensure understanding and ensure improvement and success. And so I think that like university example was really interesting, and it's just one example of kind of how one company branded their engagement for agents. But I bring it up because I think it speaks to this like integrated tech stack vision of driving engagement with agents.
Yeah. And actually, we just received kind of a really good tie-in here. We just received a question from someone in the audience. Are there any workforce management or engagement platforms you recommend? Michelle, I think I'll pass it over to you for this one.
Oh, you're turning to me. Well, when it comes to, I think the ones that I hear about in terms of like learning management tools, and this is specifically, these are the ones I'm familiar with because they integrate with Maestro, but Lessonly and Guru being really good examples of creating knowledge bases that agents can go to and learn from. I think Lessonly being more geared towards like lessons, I think that goes without saying, and Guru being a great resource for like written documentation. So here at Maestro, we use it for like every minute little fact you could learn about our product. We have it in Guru, so that way we all can find it and go back to it. So those are ones that I hear of when we talk about like engagement from the learning perspective. I think there's lots of other like workforce management, like productivity tools. I don't like your one kind of come up out of the woodwork. Leah. If you do more than others, let me know. But hopefully that helps on like the learning side that I've heard awesome things from. And the positive thing there, if you do use Maestro, is that then you can integrate Maestro with your LMS. So we can assign lessons as you're grading or as you're coaching, to really kind of close that feedback loop and guide agents to the resources that'll help them succeed.
Awesome. And I'll actually just take this moment of pause. If anybody has any questions that they want us to answer live or even save for the Q&A at the end, please feel free to drop them in. We're going to have a set time at the end of this to run through any questions that have, bubbled up over time. But if there are ones that are like very specific to what we're talking about at the moment, we'll likely go through them live. We don't want it to feel like, us just sort of running through slides talking at you. We want it to be as much of a dynamic conversation as is possible over Zoom. Great. So I think we'll move on to the next part of this engagement. And Michelle, I'm going to hand it over to you since this is a lot of what you're doing all day.
Yeah, this is a lot of my wheelhouse. And so I think as we talk about engagement, right, we are talking about different tools. So we had like training tools like our LMS or our knowledge base. And training in the way that we typically think about it is one to many. Like, how are we enabling all of our agents collectively to be successful? But what Etsy has found, as I mentioned earlier, and what I've seen time and time again, is that the best way to improve agent performance and keep agents engaged is through one-to-one coaching with your agents. The difference being coaching can be a lot more tailored to the particular agent you're working with. What do they struggle with? What are they awesome at? Finding ways to both empower those things and coach around the areas that they struggle, to really keep agents engaged with their work and keep them growing in their careers as we start to talk about career progression later. And so naturally, with a lot of the teams that I work with, we start by talking about QA. We're building a quality program and we are determining the rubric and the infrastructure of that program, and we're grading tickets. But then what are we doing with that data, right? Like QA on its own, it's a score, but that kind of happens in a vacuum unless we're applying it. And so when working with teams after our quality program is rocking and rolling, like that's when we really start digging into coaching, and ways to do that in a way that's really human with your agents. I'm sure like everyone is familiar, like most teams have some processes for one-on-ones. Some are really structured. Some are just like every manager does their own thing and we trust our managers to do this well. And so when Maestro is building out the coaching program in our tool, we really focus on these like before and after the session pieces, to build like a really comprehensive, and thought out and human coaching experience. And so before the session and thinking about what goes into coaching with agents, I think before I typically recommend digging into the agent's QA scores. Are they improving? Are they dipping? Are there specific areas we struggle with? Looking at CSAT or whatever satisfaction metrics are important to your team, whether that's customer effort score, CSAT, or a suite of others. How do our customers feel about interacting with this agent? And are there any coaching opportunities living in there? Productivity-based metrics and general topics like attendance, professional development, like what is this particular agent that I'm working with trying to accomplish? And having all of that prepared going into these conversations. And then running your one-on-ones or your coaching session with agents in a way that's open and bi-directional. And so, yes, this preparation is great, but we also want to, through our tools and just through conversations, to create more of like an open dialogue, hearing the agent's point of view, giving them the space to kind of explain why they did something a certain way or give feedback around the feedback. Creating this open dialogue so that way we're collectively learning from each other, is one of the best ways that I think coaching can be done at your organization. And we don't want coaching, we're Maestro QA, we love QA, but coaching just shouldn't be about QA only. We want to inquire about agents' well-being, their career development, what they're working towards, really like care of the whole person. And so those are typically the pieces that I see like templatized in coaching sessions and things that we want to be running through every time. again, in a way to improve agent performance and therefore the agent's experience. If the agent's performing well, they're happier and more engaged with work. So tying it back to that agent experience, I think that human coaching, led by managers or graders, however you structure that, really adds to like a positive agent experience. Yeah, I don't know. Any questions there, Leah? Did I miss anything that I could dig in deeper on?
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I just always think about even, roles that I've had, right? And of course, like I'm in marketing, I'm not an agent, but I think it's almost a general sort of human concept of like, we all want to feel listened to and empowered at work. And, the more that you can do that, I think the better for not only the agent and sort of their experience and progression, but also just like the company in general and even your customers, right? Like, again, I think it comes back to them feeling those vibes. If the agent's really engaged, if they feel supported, your customers will be able to feel that as well.
Exactly. So if that's how we're through our coaching sessions and our one-to-ones, if that's how we're empowering our agents to feel like supported and nurtured, I think that's that type of empathetic leadership like translates to the way that agents work with customers and approaching our customers in the same way.
Yeah. And even one thing I noticed, Michelle, when you were describing this, you said we, like, what are we working on? What can we do? Even simple language pivots like that make a session, I think, more inclusive, right? And more, it encourages that bi-directional dialogue rather than be like, what are you doing? What's new in your world? Like, what are we doing? What's impacting the team? I think it just brings it out and it makes it bigger. So
100%, because I think we're all working towards, I do it so I'll do it a million times. I think we're all working towards the same goals. Like as we think about team leads and their agents or graders and agents, like we're working towards making customers' lives better. Like a lot of us are in this to be helpers. We're helpers by nature. And so that's a collective goal that everyone should be working towards. And so it's in everyone's best interest to help agents do a really tough job, but do it really well. So yeah, I think that's just some of my thoughts on it.
yeah, and we're getting some great questions. So I think we're going to stick on this for a little bit from Kiania, and I hope that I am saying your name right. Question here: how do you encourage your team to engage more during one-on-one sessions? I find it feels like a lot of smiles or, kind of the makes sense, right? Or sure, but not much deeper conversation around feedback. So going back, how do you encourage your team to engage more during those one-on-ones?
Love it. It's a great question. And I totally hear you there. I think so. Some of the ways that I've seen teams do this really well, and the way kind of to support that, the way we've built out the tools in Maestro is so that way sessions can be shared with agents before that one-to-one happens. And that's something I typically recommend as you're going through this before the session work and defining what you want to talk through, sharing that with the agent the day of or the day before in preparation for the session gives them time to review what you want to talk about and digest those notes. Agents can also leave their own notes ahead of the session or during to kind of share their perspective. I think that's a really good strategy insofar as it promotes time for the agent to kind of think through the feedback. I know this is how, like when I get feedback on the spot, I'm like, okay, that totally makes sense, but I haven't had time to like process and think through it. And so sharing it ahead of time, giving me the space to kind of think through my feelings on both the feedback, the strengths, the opportunities, and put my thoughts down helps to create a more engaging conversation. And then I always try to and encourage teams to like lead with questions. And so it sounds like if we're kind of lacking agent engagement and different folks engage in different ways, but asking questions to ensure understanding or to create the space to give counter feedback is a strategy that I would use and use with my team to just promote conversation. So that's more of a personal tidbit. Those are some that come to mind for me. But yeah, anything for you?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, questions are always, it sort of forces somebody to bring themselves back into the conversation. I know, like, I think we all get Zoom fatigue, right? We spend all day online talking at a computer screen, and agents, more so, I think, than most of us are constantly having to engage digitally. But yeah, anytime that you can, I think, really open it up to questions and it forces them to show up to the conversation in a big way. And actually, it's sort of on that topic of coaching and preparing in advance for the meeting, we got another question, more specific to Etsy, but I bet there's a thread that can be drawn out more broadly. So regarding coaching, are Etsy agents expected to bring notes to their regular one-on-one, sort of the agent's point of view, or is that expectation for one-on-one prep up to the managers?
It's a great question. Since I can't speak to particularly how Etsy manages it, I'll kind of speak to how collectively I've seen groups manage it. Often, it depends how structured one-to-ones and coaching programs are, I'll say first. I think we're seeing this shift where one-to-ones just used to be a check the box thing, right? Like managers have to have one-to-ones with their agents. Cadence isn't really monitored. It's just like, it's something that you do it however you're comfortable. And a lot of the teams that I'm working with are now starting to build out more structured coaching programs within their organizations that have more set targets and goals. And so for some companies, that looks like coaching 3 times per month. For others, it's weekly coaching for lower performers and at least 1 time per month for higher performers. And so kind of building that structure becomes important. And I went a little bit off topic, but to bring it back, I'm seeing more and more asking agents to engage with the coaching, with like the coaching session before the session happens. So to review and leave their notes before the session happens. I've seen teams shift in that direction to create more of that dialogue and conversation. Because then it becomes less telling, like we're spending the session reading what was prepared versus a conversation. Like, great, I know you reviewed this. What are your thoughts about the feedback that you got on this ticket? Can you walk me through why you chose to address it that way? So we don't have to spend time catching up. We're both on the same page. We've engaged with the content beforehand and we're ready to talk about it versus telling. So that is where I've seen teams move, but I think that's a shift. And if that's new to your team, that would be a shift for both the agents and team leads or graders in preparing for that ahead of time. But that's the move that I've seen teams making, especially in conversations I've been having recently.
Awesome. Well, I think I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. So I think, we've talked a lot about engagement. And I think, in speaking about one-on-ones, we sort of naturally talk about the moment of giving critical feedback, right? Which is sort of, I don't want to call it negative because I think not all feedback, a lot of feedback can be good feedback. But I think spinning it a little bit more, the other side of things would be sort of the positive recognition that we can bring to agents. And so just really quickly, sort of running through this concept, of course, it's one thing to do good work, but it's another to be recognized for it. And for, it just feels good, right? It's sort of, I think, just natural human psychology, that it feels good when someone gives you a compliment and when they acknowledge that you're doing a really good job. So really quickly running through a few different ways that we see teams doing that. Sort of giving bigger shout outs broadly within the team or within the company is one way. We see that through Slack. Also, the team at MailChimp puts together a monthly QA newsletter and they'll shout out high performing agents in that and, like moments of goodness on the team, which I think is great. And also so incredibly on brand because they're using their product to do it, of course. We also see some teams do, rewards for their employees who perform well. Motivosity and Nectar, I think, are a few of the apps that come to mind that we see some teams use. And then sort of the third part of this is less of a tool and I think more of a mindset shift almost, but setting QA as the KPI and then giving agents access to that performance data. It not only provides quantitative recognition of performance, as in, oh, your QA scores are really high, great job, but it also gives agents a lot of control over that performance when they have that data and feel empowered to, course correct on their own. So Michelle, I know you have a lot of thoughts here and want to dive in deep to some of them.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with QA as a KPI and then backtrack a bit. But I think QA as a KPI is something that I am constantly discussing and chatting about and pushing with the teams that I work with. I think when we think about agent KPIs, we often hear about, CSAT or average handle time. And these are like the hard and fast metrics that our agents are working towards. But those take so many other things into account, right? Like customer satisfaction. Was the customer unsatisfied with a policy, but your agent did a great job? And, the agent would not get as high of a CSAT for that reason. Or handle time, looking specifically at like how quickly an agent could handle and reach a resolution. And so when I think about great KPIs for agents, QA is kind of that truest measure because it's designed by you. You're designing that rubric. Like QA is the truest measure of agent performance. And so it's such a great metric to use and strive towards and kind of make part of the culture of your team. And so the reason I call it out as a recognition tool is because when we have a QA goal that we're trying to hit for agents and when they hit it, I've seen teams come up with lots of creative ways to incentivize that. Some of that's monetary. Like I've worked with teams that get a bonus if they hit their QA KPI for the quarter or for the year. I've seen that be prize based or like a president's club of sorts, like who on the team hits their QA KPI. Now that requires our KPI to be both like challenging but realistic, and us to have great rubrics. And there's so much that goes into that. But QA as a KPI is a really great way to reward agents that are doing great work and recognize them in a slew of different ways, but have like a set KPI that we know this is what we recognize as great on the team. And so that's kind of a little bit about how we see QA as a KPI, and then having the tools to be able to see that data and self-correct and improve. So if agents have access to their QA data through Maestro or your tools, being able to understand how they're tracking towards that KPI, where they're struggling, and kind of self-correct on their own, like that just continues to help agent improvement and engagement. So that's a little bit about QA as a KPI. I think in general, when we think about incentivizing and recognition, I always recommend like chatting with your team first. People like to be recognized in super different ways. I've worked with folks who, for me personally, if you shout me out on Slack, I'm thrilled. I love it. All the emojis going, like I'm happy. There's people on my team who would hate that. Like that is their literal nightmare. And so getting a sense of how your team likes to be recognized, understanding that could be different for different folks, and having recognition channels and avenues that kind of meets everyone's style or different agent styles, I think is super important. So I like to shout that out. I think in any way, whether it's through Slack, whether it's through email, maybe we're shouting out, if we're in a really big company, shouting out a team that's doing great on their QA scores, or if we're at a smaller company, shouting out particular agents. One of my customers was rolling out a new rubric, and they added a bonus section that was new for them. And there was a prize for whoever got that bonus section first. So just kind of thinking of ways to make the work that we're doing fun and recognize people who do awesome work. I think it will look different for different organizations, but those are some of the examples that I've seen or that have stood out to me.
Awesome. I think that's a great segue too into sort of the next way to keep your agents really engaged is to provide that career progression, right? Like what if you're successful, if you're constantly getting shout outs and you're really good at your job, what does that look like for you to stay at the organization and, to move up? And I was listening, in prep again for our webinar that we just had with Care of, with Henry, who's their director of CX. And, he's very candid. Like some people want to stay in CX and some don't. And like, I think that's a truth that we all sort of have to acknowledge. Like some people might want to progress and maybe become a senior agent. Maybe they want to become a team lead managing agents, or maybe they don't. And maybe they want to go somewhere else. And for those that do, you do want to provide those opportunities. But one interesting thing that their team does is they let agents spend up to 35% of their time with another department to learn what they're doing and also to just like learn functionally about the role. But ultimately what it ends up being is they'll come back into their sort of life as an agent and use that knowledge that they've acquired either in their outreach and in making customers' experiences better, or it'll just help provide context for the team on why certain things are the way they are. And then they can sort of troubleshoot and problem solve from there. So yeah, I mean, I think, providing that path, not only for progression, but even another way to provide folks the chance to learn and sort of grow within the company. Again, ultimately, I think it really helps with retention and just with keeping everybody and keeping that knowledge on your team. And it does, trickle down to customers. Michelle, I'm sure, do you have some other examples of, ways that teams have really made progression sort of like part of their infrastructure almost?
Yeah. Yes. I think this is so important to keep our eye on, especially like I agree it's a natural progression from recognition. Like one great way to recognize great talent on your team is to give them career paths and give them promotion opportunities. And so in speaking about that, from a grow within CX perspective, one of the teams that I work with, something that they do is either when there's like low queue volumes, another team kind of bakes in some time week over week for agents to have time engaging in activities that support their own like career progression and learning and development. And so one of those activities was around self-review. So being able to take a workflow in Maestro where agents can review their own tickets. What it does is it fosters a lot of self-learning and introspection. Like how did I do on this interaction? How could I improve? That helps their career progression because it helps them improve more quickly than just the grades that we're sending every month. It also prepares agents for a career in QA or in learning and development. If that's an avenue that they want to go down, having the tools to practice those skills and see what goes into the day-to-day of that work is really valuable. And so giving agents those types of tools and those types of opportunities to engage in creative ways outside of the day-to-day of their jobs, I think is super important. I love the care of example. And I think what that speaks to for me, and it brings back that voice of customer slide from the beginning, but agents know the voice of customer probably better than anyone on your team. They know your product as well as your engineers, if not better. Like they know every nitty gritty, they know every avenue and path to success. And so keeping that knowledge in the company to me is what's most important. Whether that's on the CX team or people who know your tool really well are going to make great salespeople, or they might make great customer success managers, or a million other things. But giving agents path to success within the business, not just looking at them and their function today. One, it's great for your company. It's great for your bottom line. And two, it's great for the agent experience to know that they have paths forward and they have growth within your organization. And so I think this career chart is a good example of what it could look like to move up in CX, but also great to call out that there's ways to move throughout the company and how valuable that is. And so I think kind of any creative learning opportunities you can give agents to grow either within your CX track or outside of it, and having those tracks really defined becomes super important.
Awesome. So with that, I mean, I think we've kind of wrapped up the four main ways that, you can really recognize your agents, empower them, and provide an amazing agent experience. Of course, we do have this in an ebook form. So if that's maybe your preferred method of learning, or if you just want something to quickly reference, we'll share the link after this. But I'm going to give it, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes just to see if there are any lingering QA questions. I noticed there was some activity in the chat that was really interesting that I wanted to bring forward kind of broadly to you, Michelle, and see what your thoughts were on it. Jamie was asking, well, I'll just read it directly from the chat. So Jamie would love to hear how other teams set the benchmark for what makes a good QA score or average. Something that they've noticed on their team is that everyone is consistently getting a higher score, which is good, but sometimes the value of that time goes to the wayside as there isn't much critical feedback that can be provided. So I think the root question, like, what makes a good QA score, and what happens if everyone's getting a higher score?
Yeah. what makes a good QA score is totally dependent on your organization. And I'll dig into that. And then what happens if scores are high? I typically recommend two things. Either we got to look at our grader alignment, or we have to go back to the drawing board on our rubric. When it comes to a good QA score, we make this customizable in Maestro for that reason, to kind of work with your rubric, see what your average score is, and then kind of set what that benchmark is. So if I launch a rubric and I'm seeing average scores are around 80, then maybe my benchmark is 90. Like it's aspirational in a way that we want agents to improve to get there, but we're not saying that 100 perfection is what we're striving towards. And so because scoring on rubrics can be so customizable, whether it's weighted and where you're putting the focus of your rubric based on the goals of your QA program, to me, the number isn't as set so much as like, where are we lying right now? And then like, what's aspirational to work towards in terms of like what that benchmark should start out at. And then in terms of high scores, this is something so common. I work with so many teams that have encountered this, and it's great, right? Like our agents are doing well, and that's what we want to work towards. But I think that what I like to break down is rubrics are intended to be iterative. And so if the things that we're focusing on in our rubric, we're grading them, we're coaching to them, agents are improving, and now our scores are high. Once those scores become high, then there's less value in that data. And so rethinking the data we want to capture and the things we want to work towards and go back to the drawing board with a new rubric is typically where I see that exercise lead. And then what to include in that new rubric, I think a great way is kind of polling your team leads, your graders, your agents, like what's missing from our rubric? What are some things that like you encounter but doesn't have a home in our rubric? Where do agents struggle that maybe we're not capturing? Digging into your help desk data to see like, are there specific types of interactions where we're getting low CSAT or something like that? And using that as the basis of our new rubric, we'd expect scores to drop, and setting expectations with our teams, like that's okay. We're looking to kind of recalibrate on normal and work our way up again. And so I say, if you're seeing high scores, you did a great job. You did great on this rubric, and now start to think about how we can challenge our team more to improve, is some of the workflows that I take. And I'll pause and just say something else it could indicate is grader alignment. So that's something I've seen too, where graders are really hesitant to give a no. And if our rubric's really binary, then they might give a yes, and it's a yes, but kind of think through doing some grader QA or some calibrations to make sure it's not an alignment problem. Make sure it's not just our graders are giving high scores, even though there's opportunities to improve within this ticket. That's something to look at too. More often, I think it points to rubrics, but like to shout that out. I tend to dig into both avenues to see where we want to go for the fix.
And then we received another question that's sort of on a similar thread of just around grading and everything that comes along with it. It's like a really meaty topic. So what are your thoughts on exclusively reviewing interactions that have received a CSAT score? In this person's experience, it seems like agents feel a disconnect and therefore disengaged from QA when they seem to consistently get numerous positive CSAT scores, but their QA scores for non-CSAT or CSAT interactions are consistently middling or not quite great. So again, kind of looping back to the main question, thoughts on reviewing or on exclusively reviewing interactions that have received a CSAT score?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love tying QA to CSAT in some way. And so what I typically recommend, like some teams, and I highly recommend doing like a DSAT program, especially if we zoom out and say, what's the goals of doing QA? Why are we doing it? For some teams, that's to improve customer satisfaction or customer retention. And so that's the goal of QA. And that's like our CX vision at our company. Doing some sort of targeted DSAT analysis is really valuable to understand like why are customers unhappy. What I caution around doing that exclusively is, especially if we're looking at going with a DSAT example for a moment, then we're only pulling tickets where customers are unhappy. And what that could lead to is lower agent scores. And so that doesn't balance out the strengths of the agent as well in your QA score. So I recommend having, if that's something your team's considering, doing some DSAT analysis, having a DSAT rubric and having DSAT automations, but then also maintaining your regular QA to kind of create that balance and that culture of like agent engagement and high performance versus only looking at more like tickets where agents struggled. Something I recommend if you are looking at CSAT with QA is just keeping in mind that I'm sure as everyone is familiar when looking at comments and stuff on CSAT that sometimes CSAT's within the agent's control. Like sometimes it's people driven, other times it's policy driven, other times it's product driven. Like a customer may give a low CSAT score because the product they received was defective, and that's outside of the agent's control, even if they did everything right. And so considering that in rubric, when we think about should questions be scoring, like understanding VSAT, that's within the agent's control, but keeping in mind that things could be outside of it. So on the whole, yes, I think it's awesome to bring into the program, but just like balancing it with the more general QA work that you do.
Yeah. And then actually on the same thread, question from Katrina, what goes into a CSAT rubric? Just like, what do those questions look like?
Yeah, typically, so I'll kind of go through, and then if you are looking for an example, your CSM can always share them with you. We have a ton of great example rubrics, so reach out to your CSM. We can get that in your hands. But typically I see CSAT rubrics kind of focus on a few things, like 3 sections: people, process, product, or like process could be policy, but I like to think of them in those P's. So like, was it people driven? Yes or no? And if it was, use checkbox drivers to dig into why. Was it the agent's tone? Was it that they didn't respond with empathy? Was it that they gave the wrong information? Like what was it within the agent's control? And then what caused that? So we can really dig into like what happens on the people side that is causing low CSAT. And then like policy. So it's really valuable information for the business to understand like what policies are unpopular. Like it may be that the agent did everything right, but customers really don't like our return policy. They're really unhappy that they can only return in a certain window, or that they can only get refunded in a certain way. And so having a question around, was it policy related? Yes or no? And digging into the reasons that could be with checkboxes to capture that, super valuable. And so kind of digging into those will be custom to your organization, but that's kind of how I typically see the structure. The other piece to note there is oftentimes, not always, but if we're thinking about DSAT as more of like a categorization exercise, like we're trying to understand what the drivers are for CSAT. A lot of times teams will do this as a non-scoring rubric. So it's not because the agent isn't responsible for your product. We wouldn't want to mark the agent down for that. So building it as non-scoring, so we're capturing that data and collecting it, but it's not impacting the agent QA score because we're doing it more as like a business exercise. It's something that I've seen the teams do. So yeah, if that's new to your organization and you're interested in building that out, definitely reach out to your CSM. While y'all are the experts on the questions to ask on your rubric, we can definitely be helpful in thinking through scoring and kind of the best way to build that out to capture the data that your business wants.
Awesome. And then we have one more question from Anna, and I think this might be our last one of the day because we're coming up on the hour, which is exciting. I think it's been a great conversation and we're so glad to see everyone's questions, input, feedback, a lot of activity in the chat. So we'll end on this note from Anna. So do you see where QA specialists supplement notes for coaching sessions between agents and managers? Maybe adding notes like onto a coaching page that the agent needs to address, kind of breaking 2-way communication to have it be more of a 3-way communication and looping in that QA specialist.
Yeah, great question. Short answer, yes. Long answer. So that is a workflow that I've seen teams do. I have a couple companies in mind that I've worked with or heard about that do that workflow. And we're actually, finding ways to make that easier. That 3-way communication is stuff that's important to us in the product. But because your graders are the ones kind of frontline seeing seeing the scores and seeing those trends, something that I've seen teams do, and you can totally do within Maestro, is having kind of QA be the one to first build out that coaching session. Or if a team lead does, then a QA can come in and supplement. But a workflow I've seen is the QA team kind of owning, like, these are opportunities that a manager should look at for this particular agent, because I've graded all of their tickets now and I see what those are and I see those trends. So the QA being able to create the coaching session, but then you can assign it to a team lead. So it kind of creates that transfer of ownership for the team lead to then go in and add all of the productivity and CSAT and career development pieces as well. So QA being owned by the creation by graders, but then kind of handing it off to be run by the team lead is a really effective way that I've seen that workflow done. I have a company where graders do coaching with agents once per month, whereas team leads still kind of do their own coaching on the sides, but graders are the ones that coach to QA exclusively. So there's definitely different philosophies there. And I'd say kind of try out what works for your team. The tools in Maestro are pretty flexible, so you can do whatever makes sense for your organization, but I've seen lots of creative ways that this is done. And so kind of trial and error, trying things out. We've been doing a lot of pilot programs. We'll have, a team lead try something out for 2 weeks with just their agents, see how it goes, and then decide if we want to broaden that or go back to the drawing board. Is a great way to start to rethink some of these things if that's where your business is at.
Awesome. Well, everyone, this has been a great conversation. Just wanted to say thank you for your questions.